Thank you all for being here on this day. This is a day of memory, but we wanted to have this breakfast with Ken Feinberg, who played such a large role with the aftermath of 9/11 as our way of indicating our recognition. I'm Ross Sandler, professor of law and director of the Center for New York City Law. And I want to first just, okay, thank you. Thank you. I want to just acknowledge the founding sponsors of this breakfast, the law firm of Greenberg Traurig, Consolidated Edison, and Verizon. And also want to thank people who have voluntarily contributed to be part of the breakfast. Thank you all. Let me bring to the podium our Dean and President, Anthony Crowell, and then we'll come back and introduce the speaker today.
Thanks so much, Ross, and good morning, everyone. This is a solemn morning for all of us as we mark the 22nd anniversary of 9/11. I am pleased that you have all joined us this morning. Obviously, there are ceremonies commemorating the tragedy going on right now at the Trade Center. And I was awestruck and was given a moment of chill last night as I flew in from London and into Newark Airport, and I saw the towers of light. And as someone who had worked in city service at the time and was directly involved with 9/11 response, including leading efforts at the pier to assist victims' families, I remembered back to those painful days, painful for both New York City, our state, our nation, our world, but also I thought about the role of our law school. And while our law school was just a mere 8 blocks away from the Trade Center, we lost 4 of our community members. And since then, there have been a number who've taken ill and passed away. And I think it's really important that we take a moment out of every year, if not every day, given where we work and live in Lower Manhattan, to remember what that day meant, what it means to be an American, what the rule of law means, and also to remember what our collective responsibility is as we all move forward. I'm grateful to Professor Sandler for organizing today's breakfast, and I think we should all just take a moment and offer some silence for the victims of that terrible day. Thanks. I am reminded in the book that New York Law School published about its own proximity to the Trade Center and its reflection on the attacks. We wrote this book called 8 Blocks Away. It's a collection of memories from various community members, professors, students, friends of the school who were here or who were affected. And it's interesting. It's just one slice of the impact that rippled throughout our world. And I know that there are a number of our students here today, and I know a number of our first-year students weren't even born on 9/11. And it's marked something for us. That is not something that we have had until this year. And it's an interesting time for us to help them remember and reflect on what that day meant for our history and certainly for the law school. I also want to remember that there were many, many in this community who were students at the time. They were in law enforcement, EMTs, and others who are part of this community who gave direct response to the victims and to aiding their families. So I appreciate those collective efforts, and we seek to remember all of that each day that we move forward. We're very fortunate to have Ken Feinberg as our special guest today, and as someone who has been an extraordinary friend to New York Law School for many years. I've gotten to work with him several times since I became dean in 2012. And at that graduation ceremony, he received an honorary degree and gave an extremely empowering and passionate set of remarks to our students. And they were unforgettable. And since then, and for many years, he has helped bring some of the most powerful voices in our nation to this stage to help us understand things better through their lenses, typically through our Shane Wald lecture series. And thank you for that, Ken. We're very grateful for all that. that effort. You're a giant in the legal profession in our nation, and you've been called upon to navigate the aftermath of some of our country's most significant and devastating crises. And obviously, none was more significant than the 9/11 Victims' Compensation Fund. You have so much wisdom, and I hope you'll share not only your experiences with the Victims' Compensation Fund, but with other of the things you've handled. And I think all of us will benefit. And I particularly commend our new students who will benefit today by having a little more perspective on something that is deeply connected to our history here at the law school and to Lower Manhattan. Ross, are you coming back up before we formally ask him? Yeah, okay.
Okay, thank you, Dean Crowell. And now let me just a brief introduction of Ken. We welcome Kenneth Feinberg to New York Law School. Born in Brockton, Massachusetts, graduated from Brockton High School, University of Massachusetts, and NYU Law School, clerked for Judge Stanley Fold of the New York Court of Appeals. In 1972, Ken came to the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Southern District of New York, where I was a senior assistant with 4 years of experience, and he was a rookie. He immediately became a star, a litigator, also known for the broadest and most charming Boston accent any of us had ever heard. And the strength of that is shown by the showing of assistants who were all there with us, John Gross, Bart Schwartz, Gorman Riley over there, Rich Davis and Joe Jaffe all came to honor our colleague, Ken Feinberg. Ken, after leaving the U.S. Attorney's Office, went to work for Senator Kennedy, stayed for 9 years there, rising to the level of Chief of Staff, and then became a partner at Kay Scholler, and then Agent Orange came around. Agent Orange was a powerful herbicide used by the United States military in Vietnam to eliminate forest cover and crops as part of the war in Vietnam. More than 20 million gallons of the herbicides were spread over Vietnam. Most of it Agent Orange, which contained dioxin, a known carcinogen and cause of many other diseases. In 1979, a class action lawsuit was filed on behalf of 2.4 million veterans who were exposed to Agent Orange. The case was assigned to one of the greatest and most innovative judges in the country, Jack Weinstein in the Eastern District. Jack Weinstein, who also was here several times at the law school and was a friend of ours, was concerned. He did not think that the federal judicial system was the right place to litigate these mass torts. Agent Orange was one of the first mass tort cases to come before the courts. He didn't think the procedures were adequate. And he turned to Ken Feinberg, whom he had met as a fellow law clerk to Judge Fold, and asked Ken to solve the problem. Well, Ken didn't know the answer either, but he worked for 6 weeks and came up with a settlement of Agent Orange that arrived just the day before the jury was to be impaneled before Judge Weinstein. 7 of the largest chemical companies anteed up $180 million for compensation to the veterans and their kin. And it was Ken Feinberg's novel and ingenious system of mediation that brought that mass tort trial to a successful settlement. And that led to many more over the years: DES cases, Dalkin Shields, Shoreham, multiple asbestos cases, BP Oil, Penn State, GM, Sandy Hook, many more that Ken has been involved with and has used his talents in mediation to resolve these extremely difficult mass tort cases. And when Congress created the fund, the 9/11 Victim Compensation Fund in 2001, it was obvious that the best person in the country to run the fund would be Ken Feinberg. It is a pleasure to welcome my friend and a great lawyer to this podium, Ken Feinberg.
Well, I want to thank the dean and I want to thank Ross. Ross is an old friend from Southern District days, the U.S. Attorney's Office. I want to thank the dean and this law school. It's altogether fitting, by the way, that we kick off today, 9/11 memorial celebration here at the law school. For two reasons, I'm very, very honored to be here today at the invitation of Ross, and I might add Alice. And don't discount Alice. You don't say no to Alice, believe me. First, your proximity to the horror and what happened here on that day, or the law school on that day. And secondly, the number of lawyers that graduated from this law school who ended up assisting the 9/11 families pro bono, for 33 months while that program was implemented. So there's a debt of gratitude I have to the alumni of this great school who helped shoulder the authority, the responsibility of representing those families. Now, Ross made a brief comment about the folks sitting at this table. They are all dear friends, but it's more than that. Bart Schwartz and Joe Jaffe and their company, Guidepost, were essential during my administration of the Deepwater Horizon BP oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, where we set up a fund funded by BP. And we received over 1 million claims from 50 states and 65 foreign countries. I never thought the oil got that far from Florida, but it did. And the concern we had about fraud in all of these mass tort programs, and Bart and Joe, fabulous. The number of fraudulent claims were de minimis in BP because of the structure they set up to spot check and make sure the claims were valid. And it would have never worked without their help. Rich Davis has spent a career in public service. Even when in private practice, he was always involved in public service, and he's a perfect example of what we talk about when lawyers give back to the community. And we're very, very grateful to Rich Davis. And John Gross taught me most of what I knew at the U.S. Attorney's Office. And I'm glad to see that John is here as well to join us. Now, the 9/11 Victim Compensation Fund, you all know, or most of you know, what this is all about. 13 days after the 9/11 attacks, Congress, in its wisdom, created a no-fault victim compensation fund, a federal statute, unprecedented, that said very simply, anybody, any family that lost a loved one on 9/11, the airplanes, the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, or anybody who was physically injured as a result of the attacks, could voluntarily waive their right to go to court in Manhattan. You could waive it, voluntarily. You don't have to, you could waive it. And come into this very special fund funded entirely by the US taxpayer. No private money, no World Trade Center money, no insurance money. The taxpayer paid. And if you came into this fund, you would receive very generous compensation, and in return, waive your right to go to court. And over the 33 months of the fund, statutory limit, 97% of all the families that lost a loved one on 9/11 voluntarily entered the program. The fund was created by Congress and authorized whatever it takes to pay the claims. There was no appropriation. It was basically, we're authorizing this program, US Treasury money, and how much? Well, we don't know, but Ken will exercise his sound judgment, and whatever it cost. And it ended up that we paid out in 33 months, $7.1 billion of taxpayer money, and received releases from 97% of the people. 94 people opted not to come in. And they went to the U.S. District Court in the Southern District of New York, Judge Hellerstein, appointed by Chief Judge Mukasey. And Hellerstein told those 94 people, well, all right, I think you're nuts not to take advantage of the program. But if you want a trial, fine. Well, there was never a trial. The 94 people settled their claims with American Airlines and the World Trade Center and everybody else. There was never a trial on 9/11. Who was responsible? There was never an apology from the federal government to this day. It just was it wasn't reparations. It was a unique compensation program without an apology. This is what the United States Congress wanted to do. One, as an act of patriotism, to demonstrate to the world that we take care of our own. And secondly, to prevent people or encourage people not to litigate against the airlines, which would bring them down. If everybody started suing, it wouldn't matter whether you win or lose the suit. The mere specter of lawsuits would result in airlines, they said they'd go bankrupt over the specter of all these lawsuits. So this was the alternative. This was the alternative. Now, I must say, a program like 9/11 in Ross Sandler's tort class, he might, being a sort of creative guy, he might drop a footnote in chapter 7 dealing with damages about the 9/11 fund. The 9/11 fund, I think, 20 years later, better taught in a history class. In a class in American history. And that's because I doubt very much, and I think my doubts have been confirmed over the last 20 years, I doubt you'll ever see a fund like this again. Bad things happen to good people every day in this country. There's no 9/11 fund. I didn't see a 9/11 fund after Katrina. 1,000 people died in that hurricane. There was no 9/11 fund. Tornadoes, firestorms in Maui. They're trying, I read that the governor of Hawaii is thinking of setting up a 9/11 type fund. Well, that's a perfectly reasonable idea if that's what he wants to do. Where's the money going to come from? And how much money is there going to be? It isn't going to come from the federal government, I don't think. The 9/11 fund was rather unique. It was a tragedy, referenced implicitly at least by the dean a few minutes ago, rivaled only by the American Civil War, Pearl Harbor, the assassination of President Kennedy. That's about it. This was a unique horror. And the government rallied. Now, people ask me all the time, it must have been really difficult to value lives. I mean, how do you do that? I'm not a rabbi, I'm not a priest. How do you value the worth of a human life? Now, most of you in this room know that part of the job, actually taking out a calculator and saying this person's worth 4 million, this person's worth 1 million, this person's worth 5 million, this person's worth 800,000. That is not rocket science, you know. Every day in every court in the United States, judges and juries do that all the time. And the formula used is sort of sacrosanct. It's been historically ratified over hundreds of years in this country. One, what would the person have earned over a work life but for the tragedy? Add to that, second, pain and suffering, emotional distress. Add it up, basically, there's your award. See chapter 7 of Ross's tort textbook. There it is. Basically, it's economic loss plus non-economic loss, and it guarantees that the banker, the stockbroker, the lawyer, the doctor will receive more money than the waiter, the busboy, the soldier, the fireman. They made more, they get more. That's capitalism. That's the American system. I doubt very much it's ever going to change very much. And juries and judges deal with that problem every single day. You can sit in a courtroom in the Southern District and see them in action. That's basically it. You see, that's not the tough part. The tough part in any of these funds, 9/11, the best example, but Deepwater Horizon, as Bart knows and Joe, the GM Cobalt ignition switch problem that resulted in so many young people being killed when the automobile malfunctioned going 60, 70, 80 miles an hour. But all of these funds, you see, have one real common denominator that tests your mettle not as a lawyer, but as a human being. And that is the emotion that is associated with setting up a program weeks, months after the tragedy, and turning that emotion, trying to channel that emotion, that horror, into a very cold, calculating system of check writing. And when people say, boy, Ken, that must be tough, it's very tough because you're dealing with very vulnerable people. And when you offer, as you must, to meet with those individuals in private, you better brace yourself for what you're going to hear. For what you're going to hear. Mr. Feinberg, I'm here to see you in private. I'm 26 years old, and my husband was a firefighter at the World Trade Center. He died on 9/11. And he left me with our two children, 6 and 4. Now, Mr. Feinberg, you've sent me the application and I've submitted it, and I'm going to receive $3.8 million tax-free. I'm here to tell you, I want it in 30 days. Well, Mrs. Jones, I mean, this is federal taxpayer money. I've got to go down to the U.S. Treasury, and they've got to run traps and make sure liens, and do you owe money to the feds, back taxes, et cetera. It may take 60 or 90 days, but you'll get your money. No. 30 days. I said to her, Mrs. Jones, why do you need the money in 30 days? She says, why? I'll tell you why, Mr. Feinberg. I have terminal cancer. I have 10 weeks to live. My husband was going to survive me and take care of our 2 little ones. They're going to now be orphans. I don't have a lot of time. I need to get this money. I've got to set up a trust. I've got to find a guardian. I don't have a lot of time, and I need this money while I still have my faculties. Well, we raced down to the Treasury and we walked the compensation through the system, and we got her money in 30 days. 8 weeks later, she died. And when you have these case after case like that, a woman comes to see me sobbing. And she says, Mr. Feinberg, I lost my husband. He was a fireman at the World Trade Center. When the plane hit the tower, he raced into the lobby and brought 20 people to safety before the building collapsed. He saw another 20 were trapped. He ran in a second time and brought them to safety. Mr. Feinberg, while he was running across the World Trade Center plaza, he was killed when somebody jumped from the 103rd floor and hit him like a missile, killing them both. If he had taken one step either way, he'd be here today. Don't tell me there's a God, Mr. Feinberg. No God would allow my husband to die that way. And when I conducted myself about 950 of these hearings. And it is debilitating. And anybody who, wants to take on this role, what's really important is not the merit of the methodology or how you calculate the damages. People in this room can do that. People at this table could do that, I think, quite easily. That's not the problem. Can you take the emotional pressure, the stress of implementing these programs? And I mean, the 33 months that we did this, we had a staff, Bart and Joe, part of it. We had a staff. And in BP, for example, BP was a different problem, you see. That oil rig, we set up a fund. Now, wait a minute. You just said that the 9/11 fund will never be replicated. I believe that. BP was different. It was a fund. It was a fund that was funded entirely by BP. That wasn't a federal program. The fund was set up because President Obama brought BP into the White House and said, I want you to set up a fund for the victims of the spill, and I want $20 billion. $20 billion. I mean, congratulations to President Obama. We knew immediately. You can pay everybody in the Gulf of Mexico who has a claim, business interruption claim, loss of profits. You can't go to, the Gulf is closed. You can't fish. You can't boat tourism, oyster harvesting, shrimp harvesting. There's no way you're going to fund those claims and need $20 billion. And over 16 months, we paid out $6.5 billion, received 550,000 releases, received over 1 million claims. We got claims in BP from Alaska. I mean, really? From Alaska, you got to go to Ross Sandler's book, Textbook on Torts, and study what is probable cause. When somebody says, I have a restaurant in Alaska, I can't get Gulf shrimp, pay me. It's not easy. But the problem we had in BP, unlike 9/11, with too many claims, volume, everybody sees a way to get money. So that's the whole point of the program. So we had to come up with an innovative, creative, efficient way to pay claims. Now notice, in 9/11, in BP, Ross mentioned to me, yes, the GM ignition switch automobile defect program. In those cases, if you take the money, you sign a release. I will not sue anybody. So there is a trade-off. We'll divert the claims out of the tort system. We'll develop a more efficient, voluntary alternative, purely voluntary. But we'll entice people into the system by providing two very important magnets: speed, efficiency, generosity. Speed and efficiency, you'll get your money quick, and you'll get your money as if you were suing. It's not like we'll reduce it like workers' comp. It's not like workers' comp, where you'll take money quicker, more speedily, but you're taking a lot less than what the tort system would provide. No. In these programs, we're substituting the judgment of a private program or an alternative program. For the conventional tort system, you're going to get just as much, maybe more, if you don't have to pay a lawyer, than you would, and you'll get it quicker. That's the trade-off. And these programs, if they're set up correctly, they work. But remember now, in the examples I've given, 9/11, BP, GM, all alternatives to the tort system. Lawyers are involved. Lawyers have to recommend and explain to their clients the trade-off. Now you get to all these other programs I've administered, like the Boston Marathon bombings in April of 2015, where Mayor Menino and Governor Deval Patrick asked the country, send in private donations. $60 million in 30 days came in. The Pulse nightclub shootings in Orlando, Florida, where a gunman goes into a gay bar and kills 50 people. And the city of Orlando announces, anybody who wants to contribute, please send money in, a 501c3 contribution, charitable deduction, $30 million. The tragedy, the shooting in Connecticut of the 25 first graders by a deranged gunman. 25 first graders killed. Send in your money. We welcome any donations, $11 million. Now, programs like the Boston Marathon, Pulse nightclub, Sandy Hook in Connecticut, those cases are not in Ross's tort textbook. They have nothing to do with torts. Those cases are a gift from the American people who contributed. You don't have to sign any release. Take the money and hire a lawyer if you want. Interesting thing is very few people sue, even after they get the money. But that money is not tied to the tort system. You're not waiving your rights to litigate if you want to give it a shot. That's up to you. And that money is different, but there's a similarity, of course. The similarity is the same emotion that you can't escape with 9/11. You see it in these private gift programs. The Boston Marathon, I get a call. Mr. Feinberg, I'm applying to the fund, the One Fund Boston, but I can't come to see you because I lost my left leg. It was blown off at the hip when the bombs went off. And I'm in Spalding, the rehab hospital in Charlestown in Boston, Mass. I said, that's all right. I'll come over and I'll see you. You can't get to see me. I'll grab a cab. I'll drive over, 2 miles to Spalding, and I'll hear what you have to say. So I went over there. I walk into the room, the hospital room, and there he is lying in bed, one leg, the other leg gone at the hip. And on his lap is his 8-year-old son. And around the bedroom, around the hospital bed, his wife, his brother, his mother. They're all sitting there. I walk in and I say to this injured victim, I say, Mr. Jones, this is terrible what happened. And I want you to know that the One Fund Boston will provide you a check for $1.2 million, tax-free. And don't have to sign anything. It's a gift. And I just wanted you to know that. He says to me, Mr. Feinberg, you're going to offer me $1.2 million for my leg. I got a better idea. I got a better idea for you to think about. Keep the money. Give me my leg back. How's that? How about giving me my leg back? You keep the money. Give me my leg back. He said, Mr. Jones, I wish I had that power. I don't. All I can do is try and provide you some financial assistance. Yeah, great. Well, you get out of there as fast as you can. There's no point. There's no point. You can't change the dynamic or the tone of the conversation. Well, this is the best I could do, and you leave. And you make mistakes in these programs. Every program I've ever designed and administered, you make mistakes. It's human nature. I'll never forget in 9/11, an old man came to see me, about 84 years old, not old by this table, but an old man. An old man came to see me, 84 years old, tears streaming down his face. He says, Mr. Feinberg, I lost my son at the Pentagon. When the plane hit the Pentagon, he escaped. He got out safely. But he thought that his sister, who also worked there, was trapped. So he went back into the burning building to look for her. She had already escaped to safety through another door. He didn't know that. He died looking for her. He died looking for her. Mr. Feinberg, my life is over. A father should never have to bury a son. And I just want you to know that no amount of money is going to temper my distress. And I looked at him, I said, you know, Mr. Jones, this is a terrible story. And then I said to him, terrible story. I know how you feel. Wow. This guy, very nice man. He puts his hand on my shoulder. Says, Mr. Feinberg, you have a very difficult job. I don't envy what you have to do, but I want to give you some friendly advice. Don't ever tell a father like me that you know how I feel. You have no idea how I feel. And it sounds sort of robotic and you know, pretentious. And I just want, well, I'll never do that again. I'll never say I know how you feel, but you make these mistakes. You're in uncharted seas when you deal with these emotional issues. And you see, we could spend a Ross Sandler tort class discussing the 9/11 fund or analyzing the differences between the 9/11 victim compensation no-fault administrative scheme and the tort system. But it's not particularly difficult. In fact, when Congress passed the 9/11 fund, it stated in the statute that the special master appointed by the administration, by President Bush, the Attorney General, John Ashcroft, the special master in calculating damages shall be guided by the tort law of the state of the victim's domicile. So that we knew from the statute that when you start calculating these awards, look to the law of New York, look to the law of Connecticut, of New Jersey, of Maryland, of Virginia. Look to the law of foreign governments. When people died at the World Trade Center visiting the Pentagon who were domiciled in Saudi Arabia or Israel. And that makes the job somewhat easier in terms of actually conceptualizing and calculating what a life is worth. Look to that law. Of course, it isn't that simple. Because when it comes time to decide, for example, who gets the money, you know, everybody in the United States at the time was focused on the size of the awards and how they varied depending on economic loss, etc. Congress never, ever in any way in the statute ever contemplated problems in deciding once the award is calculated, who are the survivors that get the money? Now, we decided the only way to determine who gets the money is to look to the estate law of the domicile of the victim. What does an estate law in Maryland or New York say where there's no will? Now, if there was a will, you see, we followed the will. And I must say, John Ashcroft, a hero of mine when it comes to the 9/11 fund, a hero. There was some, in the absence of a will, there were a few wills, where the victim said, when I die, if and when I die, my estate should go to my same-sex partner. Now, back in 2001, there were no laws that allowed, in the absence of a will, there was no law that allowed a same-sex partner to be compensated. So John Ashcroft, when there was a will, John Ashcroft, a very conservative Republican, but a very smart man, very political. He said to me, well, what are you going to do? If there's a will, you're going to give the money to a same-sex partner. I go, that's what the will says. That's state law. That's the will of that state. He goes, you're right. Honor the will, even if it goes to a same-sex partner. But in other cases where there was no will, the number of disagreements we got into between biological parents of the victim or a same-sex partner or somebody about to be married, there were a few very, very tricky issues. Now, we had an ally, I remember, in Judge Roth here at the Surrogate Court in Manhattan. Judge Roth was fabulous. She was hand in glove with the 9/11 fund. And she said, I'll do everything I can to help within the confines of the law to try and make sure that people who were equitably entitled would get the money. And she tried her best. She brought the biological parents in to see her with the same-sex partner. What's going on here? There's $3 million to distribute here. Now, are you going to work this out? I'll help you work this out. And she tried, and pretty much, a heavy hand. At the end of the day, there were 18 claims in 9/11. Out of 7,300 applications, there were 18 claims where the biological parents would not agree to give a portion of the award to a same-sex partner. And we sent the money to the surrogates court. Work it out down there. I'm not going to get in the middle. I can't get in the middle of that. Very, very problematic. But for the most part, with Judge Roth's help, we were able to distribute the money very, very quickly. Now, every once in a while, you see, people contemplate maybe we ought to set up a fund like 9/11. Well, the federal government has no interest in setting up a fund like that again. None. I'm not sure that's a bad idea, frankly. I mean, the self-reliance of the American people, no one looks to the government in a time of tragedy like that to set up a no-fault taxpayer-funded program. I thought at the time that it would be a real problem and that I would really be attacked. Turns out, never underestimate the charitable impulse of the American people. Never underestimate it. Not only wasn't I attacked, I was universally praised for administering that program. I would walk down, years later, you walk down an airline terminal, and someone comes over and you say, uh-oh, aren't you the guy that did the 9/11 fund? Yeah. On behalf of the American people, we thank you, and ba-bum, even though it's over $7 billion of taxpayer money that was paid out in the course of that program. So on this day, I look back from sort of with a historic lens, not a legal lens. The legal implications of the 9/11, it's a one-off program, I think, a one-off. The funding source, the way it worked, its interface with a hero of mine, Judge Hellerstein, who urged everybody to come into the fund. The American the lawyers of America stood fast and tall in this program. 1,800 people were represented pro bono by lawyers from 43 states. Pro bono. California, 15 lawyers came east to help represent people. It was marvelous. And I want to take a few questions, but I want to say this also. I try and explain to people that, 20 years ago, 21 years ago, it's not like, in a historical perspective, it's not like the Civil War or the Revolution. I mean, it was only 21 years ago. I think today, the likelihood that Congress would ever even consider a 9/11 fund is like infinitesimal. I don't think you could ever get Congress to set up a program like this. And I think that it was the right thing to do. I defend it 20 years later. It exhibited some of the best characteristics, I think, of the American people. Don't ever do it again. Don't ever do it again. Because I think you start selecting during 9/11, during my administration of the fund, you should have seen some of the letters I got. Dear Mr. Feinberg, my son died in Oklahoma City, the victim of domestic terrorism. Where's my check? Dear Mr. Feinberg, I don't understand. My daughter died in the basement of the World Trade Center in the original 1993 attacks committed by the very same type of people. Where's my check? And it wasn't just terrorism. Dear Mr. Feinberg, explain something to me. Last year, my wife saved 3 little girls from drowning in the Mississippi River, and then she drowned a heroine. Where's my check? You start singling out people for taxpayer benefit. 9/11, it worked. The country rallied around the program. It was patriotism, really. I don't think it's a good idea to replicate it. Self-reliance is part of the American system. People buy life insurance for tragedies like this. So, but it is a very bright light in American history, how that 9/11 program worked and how I doubt it could be replicated, but I think that it worked then, and it worked thanks to the Congress, the American people, the people at this table. And so I was grateful to be a part of it. We have about 10 minutes, and I'm sure it's New York Law School, so I'm sure there are questions.
We do have microphones here. If the people do want to ask questions, come up to the microphone. I do want to say to you, Ken, that you are a footnote in my casebook.
And there it shall stay.
It's a long footnote, but it is a footnote.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, over here. Let's go there. Yes.
Yeah.
No, go first. Go.
Ken, just one thing. Why did this fund stop after 33 months? And who stopped it? How was it stopped?
The fund ended in 33 months by statute. When they created the fund, Congress, they said it will expire in 2003, and it expired. We stayed till 2005 in order to process the claims, but by statute, it had to end at the end of 33 months. And at the end of the 33 months, only 2 people failed to either come into the fund or opt into the litigation system. Paralyzed by grief, a priest and an elderly woman did nothing. They never came into the fund and they never filed a lawsuit.
Thank you.
Yes, good morning. I'm Michael Myers. I'm the president of New York Civil Rights Coalition. First, let me just do something that everybody in America, I think, should do, is I just commend you for what your integrity and your brilliance and your compassion for the victims of 9/11. I want to say that to you. That's why I got up this morning. My question is, what about the US government going after the perpetrators of 9/11? Is there any more information about that? Because there's been a sort of like, okay, we're gonna forget it. And I don't think there's something to forget. Right.
You ask a very good question. My simple answer is, in terms of the US government seeking the perpetrators or those behind it, not on my watch. My watch was strictly compensating the victim side. I wasn't concerned about deterrence. I wasn't concerned about proactive foreign policy. The federal government largely, especially state and the National Security Council, they left me alone because they knew I had nothing to do with tracking down in Afghanistan or Iraq or Saudi Arabia, the perpetrators. Now, if you want to get into that, read a very good report of the 9/11 Commission, 2 volumes, that discusses in some detail where the attackers came from, where they received counsel and sustenance, and what the United States government did about it. Now, I have enough problems without focusing on that very good issue.
Good morning. Thank you, Mr. Feinberg. You tell such a wonderful story about such a depressing event. I had a question about how you found all the victims. I'm thinking of people who were undocumented at the time, people who had relatives outside the United States. Can you just tell me about the process and how you actually managed to locate those victims? And if you're satisfied that people who died there were actually compensated, the families?
It wasn't difficult to find the families of the victims. You had airplane manifests. You had New York City Police Department death certificates. You had the military and all those who died at the Pentagon. We received some very good information that very quickly allowed us to track undocumented workers in the World Trade Center, foreign nationals who happened to be visiting at the Pentagon. We found them and we paid them. You know, it's very interesting. The 9/11 fund made no distinction at all between citizens and non-citizens. Everybody was eligible. And the problem we had with undocumented workers, especially in the Bronx, they were very concerned that if they took the money based on the death of their husband or wife who was an undocumented worker, they would be deported. And we had to go up there with a Spanish interpreter and convince them that they would be not only protected, but they would get a green card in return. And eventually we got everybody in. We got all the foreign claimants in. They thought at first, when I met with them in London, it was a trap, CIA. Then they wanted to know, do you get paid in American dollars or in foreign currency? I said, no, American dollar, like that. And all of them, virtually all of them, eventually came into the program. Time for two more.
The point of the parents against the same-sex partner. My question to you, were any of them in New York? And did any of them live in apartment buildings that were rent stabilized? Because I had an issue back in like the 90s, early 90s, where I had lived with actually male for an entire decade. And, you know, they always hated me because I was Black. So they tried to get me out of it. And then when we broke up, they tried to throw me out. But miraculously, the night before I had to go to court, I saw on TV and tried to throw out this gay guy who lived with another guy. And they came up with what constitutes a family in a rent stabilized home. So they couldn't throw him out because he was considered family in New York State. They couldn't throw me out even though it was a man and a woman, because it was what constitutes a family, and I winded up winning the case back then. So under that premise, would they been able to get the money based on what constitutes a family?
No, because under the law, many of these families were in New York. Under the law of New York at the time, there was no recognition of eligibility unless you were formally married pursuant to the law of the domicile of the victim. Now, doesn't matter if you lived together for 20 years. That wasn't recognized as a marriage. Now, I'll never forget Governor Pataki. We're at a big meeting hosted by Pataki at the Javits Center or one of these. There were almost 1,000 people there. And Pataki, politician that he is, says to me in front of all these people, and why won't you pay people like you or people who are same-sex partners? It's outrageous. And I get up there and I say, Governor, I agree it's outrageous. Now, if you'll go to Albany and change the law, the estate law of New York, to allow same-sex partners or family living together as a family, yeah, I'll be glad to follow state law. Well, never heard it from him again. I mean, that was the end of that. But you raised, this is the inequity.
But I don't understand if it was
We have to
what
go with it.
constitutes a family and they accept.
That's under state law. You'd have to go and say to me, what's under state law? Will they recognize a spouse? And they wouldn't at the time.
We're gonna have to go to the other side.
So you spoke about various T&E issues relating to same-sex couples. what about consanguinity issues when there was no one to take? Did some of the probate judges do a workaround, or was there ultimately escheatment of some of the funds to the state?
We had no trouble. No, we didn't escheat any of the money to the states. We found under state law, you go up high enough and you'll end up with cousins getting the money under law, siblings, first cousins. We didn't have any situations where there was no one left to receive the money. If there had been, we would have not distributed the money to anybody. If there's nobody to receive it, we wouldn't have received it. We might have given it to a charity. I don't know. At the time, Richard Davis here was working of helping the charities. And we had constant communication about how we should not be deducting from these awards charitable amounts. Under the law, you could make an argument charitable amounts to these victims should have been deducted from our awards. Richie just, he smiled and said, if you do that, we're going to wait till you distribute all your money. You'll look like an idiot. And I said, you're right. We didn't. I always listened to him, so we never distributed the money. But he remembers that, I'm sure. Anyway,
Okay, stay
thank
here.
you.
Okay, thank you. So a really interesting morning. This is a great story you tell, and it is wonderful to hear it and to hear it live. I know it's been a movie, I know it's a book, but it's great to be with you and hear it directly from you. And thank you so much for sharing the morning. As we like to do, we like to give a product of the scholarship of this law school. And this is from our good friend Annette Gordon-Reed, who was here for 17 years before she was snapped up by Harvard. But she wrote a wonderful book called On Juneteenth, a memoir by her of her growing up in Texas and her feelings for Texas and Juneteenth. I think you'll like the book, and we give it with thanks for a wonderful morning.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you all. We'll be back in October. Thank you all for coming.